Here is the rewritten narrative. In ancient times, around 5200 BCE, a pivotal event occurred on Tasmania that would have far-reaching consequences for the island's indigenous inhabitants. Let us transport ourselves back in time to an era when the Tasmanian Land Bridge still connected the island to the Australian mainland. As we venture onto the land bridge, we find ourselves amidst a thriving metropolis. The air is thick with the scent of eucalyptus, and the sound of didgeridoos echoes through the valleys. The Tasmanian Aborigines had built a sophisticated society with elaborate rock art adorning the walls of ancient caves, telling stories of their ancestors and creation myths that bound them to the land. But around this time, the climate began to shift. A gradual cooling trend set in, causing sea levels to rise and the Tasmanian Land Bridge to narrow. The once thriving metropolis found itself facing an existential threat as the bridge began to disappear beneath the waves. As the land bridge receded, the Tasmanian Aborigines were forced to adapt to their new reality. Their society was built upon a strong spiritual foundation, with a profound respect for the natural world. But the loss of access to the mainland's rich hunting grounds and fertile lands would have devastating consequences for their way of life. In the midst of this catastrophe, the Tasmanian Aborigines turned to their shamans and elders, seeking guidance on how to survive in a rapidly changing world. It was during this era that new cultural practices emerged as they adapted to their new environment and forged a sense of identity in the face of adversity. As we gaze out upon the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe, we are reminded of the resilience and adaptability of humanity's earliest inhabitants. Despite the challenges they faced, the Tasmanian Aborigines continued to thrive on this island, forging a unique cultural identity that would endure for generations to come. Their story serves as a testament to the power of human ingenuity in the face of adversity, and the indelible mark they left on the ancient history of Tasmania. As the fog lifted from the rugged Tasmanian coastline, an eerie stillness settled over the land. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the very earth held its breath in preparation for the unfolding drama. This moment would forever be etched in the collective memory of this ancient land, a catastrophe that would reshape the destiny of its people. In the weeks leading up to the fateful day, the skies grew increasingly turbulent. Dark clouds gathered, heavy with moisture, and the winds whispered secrets to those who listened closely. The indigenous population, attuned to the rhythms of nature, sensed something was amiss. They watched as the sea level began to rise, as if reality itself was stretching to contain the pent-up forces. On that appointed day, the Tasmanian Land Bridge began to tremble and convulse. The earth cracked open, releasing a maelstrom of energy that shook the foundations of the land. A gash opened up, severing the connection between the mainland and the island forever. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The sea surged in, flooding the newly created gap with icy waters that had previously been trapped in the upper reaches of the ocean. A behemoth tidal wave crashed against the shores, inundating coastal settlements and displacing entire communities. Only a few thousand survivors remained, left to face an uncertain future. As the waters receded, the true extent of the disaster became apparent. The land bridge, once a lifeline for trade, cultural exchange, and migration, lay in ruins. The island was plunged into a state of siege, its inhabitants forced to adapt to a new reality where resources were scarce and survival became an everyday battle. The aftermath was marked by chaos and devastation. Ecosystems teeming with life were decimated as species struggled to cope with the sudden loss of habitat and food sources. The skies grew darker, as if heaven itself mourned the passing of a world that had been lost forever. The people suffered greatly, their numbers dwindling due to disease, hunger, and despair. In the years that followed, the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe would be remembered as a defining moment in this ancient land's history. It would shape human settlement, cultural development, and environmental adaptation, leaving an indelible mark on the collective psyche of those who called Tasmania home. The catastrophe occurred circa 40,000 BCE. As sunset painted the Tasmanian Land Bridge with warm orange hues, the sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air. Families crossed the narrow isthmus, 45 kilometers at its narrowest point, as they had for millennia. Women carried baskets laden with freshly gathered seafood and shellfish, while children chased after curious wallabies and kangaroos. Men, armed with wooden spears and stone tools, walked alongside the women, their eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. This natural connection between Tasmania and the Australian mainland was a place of great importance, where people from both sides came to trade goods, share stories, and strengthen bonds. It was here that ancient cultures were born, traditions passed down through generations, and the fabric of society woven. The land bridge was more than just a physical link. It was a spiritual gateway to the world beyond. As the moon rose into the night sky, the bridge took on a mystical quality. The soft glow illuminated the rugged terrain, casting long shadows across the ground. People gathered around campfires, sharing tales of their ancestors and the spirits that dwelled in this sacred place. The land bridge was a hub of activity where people came to seek guidance from the ancient ones, pray for fertility and abundance, and make pacts with the mysterious forces that governed their lives. It was a place where the past, present, and future converged, but despite its importance, the Tasmanian Land Bridge was not immune to the whims of nature. The sea was unpredictable, and storms could rage across Bass Strait in a matter of hours. On such occasions, the bridge became a treacherous path where strong winds and rough seas threatened to sweep people away like feathers on a windy day. It was during one such storm that the land bridge would meet its demise. Around 5200 BCE, a massive earthquake struck the region, causing the seafloor to shift and the land masses to realign. The bridge, once a sturdy artery of communication and commerce, was torn asunder, leaving Tasmania isolated from the mainland. The aftermath of this catastrophe was one of devastation and despair. People were left stranded on both sides of the newly formed Bass Strait, struggling to survive in a world that had been forever changed. The Tasmanian Land Bridge, once the lifeblood of ancient cultures, was now nothing more than a distant memory, a relic of a bygone era. Yet even in death, the land bridge continued to play a vital role in shaping the course of human history. It was here that the seeds of a new civilization were sown, as people adapted to their new circumstances and forged new ways of living in the face of adversity. The Tasmanian Land Bridge may have been silenced by the ravages of time, but its legacy lived on, influencing the development of cultures and societies for millennia to come. As the sun rose over the Tasmanian Land Bridge in 5293 BCE, anticipation hung heavy in the air. The once stable lifeline was beginning to show signs of strain, its foundations eroded by tectonic activity beneath the surface. Slowly but surely, the land bridge's stability was waning. To the north, the Bass Strait was widening as sea levels continued their relentless rise. The weight of the world's oceans exerted a subtle yet insidious pressure on the land bridge's flanks, buckling its ancient landscape. The ground itself seemed to be shifting like the sands of an hourglass, as if reality was being rewritten. As inhabitants of Tasmania and the Australian mainland went about their daily lives, they couldn't help but notice the subtle changes taking place beneath their feet. They had long relied on this fragile lifeline to traverse the waters separating their homelands, knowing every twist and turn, every hidden cove and rocky outcropping, like the lines on a well-worn map. But as the land bridge began to destabilize, they couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would it remain steadfast, a constant in an ever-changing world, or would it succumb to the relentless forces shaping its fate? As the years ticked by, one thing was certain. The Tasmanian Land Bridge stood on the cusp of a transformation that would forever alter the course of human history. The clock was ticking and the stakes were higher than ever before. The indigenous people had long traversed this lifeline, their lives intimately tied to its stability. As the land bridge's fragility became increasingly apparent, they found themselves facing an uncertain future. Would they find a way to adapt to the changing landscape, or would the very foundations of their world crumble beneath their feet? As the sun rose over the Tasmanian Land Bridge, an unsettling sense of foreboding settled over its inhabitants. The air was heavy with tension, as if the earth itself was warning of impending doom. For generations, this vital artery had connected Tasmania to the Australian mainland, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures between the two populations. The earliest settlers, a hardy and resourceful people, had long adapted to the rhythms of the sea and the shifting sands of the coastline. They had learned to read nature's subtle signs, the changes in wind direction, the whispered warnings of migrating birds, and the gentle nudges of seismic activity beneath their feet. But as the years passed, A growing sense of unease began to manifest itself in the dreams and waking thoughts of these people. The land bridge, once a reliable companion, was starting to betray its trust. The shoreline, once stable, now seemed to shift and writhe like a living serpent, as if it too were feeling the tremors that had begun to rock the foundations of their world. The signs were unmistakable. Sea levels were rising, and the land bridge was groaning under the strain. Initially dismissed as mere anomalies, these changes became more frequent and pronounced. The people of the land bridge knew their way of life was under threat, and they could do little to stop it. As the years ticked by, the pace of change accelerated. The tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface continued to shift and grind against each other, causing the land bridge to buckle and flex in ways that were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The people of Tasmania and mainland Australia watched in horror as the sea crept ever closer, threatening to engulf their homes, livelihoods, and very existence. In this atmosphere of mounting dread, a sense of community and cooperation emerged. The inhabitants of the land bridge, once divided by petty squabbles and territorial disputes, came together to face the common threat that loomed before them. They shared their knowledge, pooled their resources, and worked tirelessly to build new settlements away from the encroaching sea. Despite these efforts, the catastrophe was inevitable. The land bridge, once a symbol of connection and community, had become a fragile and treacherous lifeline hanging precariously between the mainland and Tasmania. As the people looked out upon their world, they knew the end was near and that nothing would ever be the same again. In the centuries to come, the Tasmanian Land Bridge disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it an entire way of life and a people who had called it home for millennia. The catastrophe left its mark on the region's history, shaping the course of human settlement and cultural development for generations to come. As the ancient Tasmanian inhabitants gazed out at their once stable land bridge, they sensed the ominous signs of change beneath their feet. The earth trembled increasingly, while creaking rocks and shifting sands filled the air with an eerie soundtrack. By approximately 5293 BCE, the land bridge had become unstable due to tectonic activity and rising sea levels. As the days passed, the inhabitants grew restless, their daily routines disrupted by the growing unease in the earth. They witnessed the rocky shore crumbling, its fragments washed away with each receding tide. The constant crash of waves against the shore served as a grim reminder of the catastrophic changes unfolding before their eyes. As the land bridge began to collapse, the ancient Tasmanians were forced to adapt to an environment that was rapidly changing. Rising sea levels encroached upon their shores, isolating communities and fragmenting their way of life. The once stable coastline became a dynamic, ever-shifting landscape, as if reality itself had been torn asunder. The inhabitants' daily lives became a struggle for survival. They scrambled to secure food and shelter as traditional hunting grounds and sacred sites were gradually consumed by the encroaching sea. Coastal communities, once thriving, now clustered together on higher ground, their very existence threatened by the relentless tide of change. As the ancient Tasmanians looked out upon their altered world, they must have felt a deep sense of disorientation and loss. Their connection to the land, so deeply ingrained in their culture and identity, was being torn asunder. The collapse of the land bridge reshaped not only their environment, but also their way of life. As sea levels continued to rise, the Tasmanian inhabitants were compelled to adapt and innovate. They developed new strategies for hunting and gathering, exploiting the changing coastal ecosystem to survive. Their traditional ways gave way to a more flexible nomadic existence, as they learned to navigate unpredictable tides and shifting sands. In this era of upheaval and transformation, the ancient Tasmanians demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for resilience and adaptation. As their world was rewritten by the forces of nature, they found innovative ways to thrive in the face of adversity. Their story serves as a testament to the indomitable human spirit, which can find solace even in turbulent times. As we gaze upon this momentous era in Tasmanian history, we are reminded that the collapse of the land bridge was not merely an environmental event, but also a profound cultural and existential crisis. It was a time when the very foundations of ancient Tasmanian society were reshaped by the power of nature, forever altering their relationship with the land and the sea. As the land bridge began its precipitous descent into the abyss, the Tasmanian people found themselves trapped in a maelstrom of rising tides and treacherous currents. The once stable connection to the mainland vanished, leaving their communities fragmented and isolated. In this desperate situation, the indigenous inhabitants of Tasmania were compelled to devise innovative solutions to navigate the unforgiving new environment. Their ingenuity would be put to the ultimate test as they struggled to survive in a world where every passing day brought new challenges and perils. The Tasmanian people responded with remarkable resilience, harnessed by their deep connection to the land and their ancestors' wisdom. They set about crafting watercraft that would allow them to traverse the treacherous waters now separating them from the mainland. Skilled artisans and master craftsmen worked tirelessly to design and build vessels capable of withstanding the relentless pounding of the waves. The early attempts at creating seaworthy craft were marked by trial and error, as the Tasmanians learned to adapt their traditional building techniques to the harsh marine environment. Though the initial results were promising, it soon became clear that even the most sturdy constructions would be no match for the unrelenting fury of the sea. Undeterred, the Tasmanians continued to refine and improve their designs, driven by a deep-seated determination to preserve their way of life. As they worked, the air was filled with the sounds of chiseling, sawing, and shaping, as craftsmen labored tirelessly to create vessels that would be both seaworthy and versatile. Years passed, and the Tasmanians' innovative watercraft became increasingly sophisticated, featuring cleverly designed hulls, sturdy masts, and ingenious rigging systems. The construction of these remarkable vessels was a testament to the people's resourcefulness, creativity, and unwavering commitment to their survival. However, despite their best efforts, the Tasmanian people were unable to fully mitigate the catastrophic consequences of the land bridge's collapse. The relentless rise in sea levels continued unchecked, isolating their communities and limiting their access to vital resources. As the years went by, the very fabric of their society was stretched to breaking point as they struggled to cope with the unrelenting tide of adversity. As the Tasmanians fought to preserve their way of life, they were also forced to confront the harsh realities of their new environment. Rising sea levels had ravaged their traditional hunting grounds and agricultural areas, leaving them vulnerable to hunger and disease. The once thriving populations began to dwindle as the relentless onslaught of environmental challenges took its toll. In this desperate era, the Tasmanian people's very existence was threatened by the unrelenting forces of nature. Despite their valiant efforts to adapt and survive, they found themselves on the precipice of a catastrophic collapse that would ultimately reshape the course of their history forever. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge began to crumble, ancient society's foundations shook. The once stable landmass buckled under the relentless pressure of rising sea levels, transforming into a treacherous terrain. With each passing day, the bridge narrowed, its edges worn down by the pounding waves. The Tasmanians struggled to adapt as their communities became isolated and vulnerable. The predictable tides gave way to chaos, threatening to sweep away entire settlements, leaving only scattered survivors. The very fabric of their society, built on generations of shared culture and tradition, began to unravel. As the catastrophe unfolded, the Tasmanians confronted the stark reality of their situation. Gone were the days when they could traverse the land bridge freely, sharing knowledge, stories, and resources between communities. The stable world gave way to uncertainty, where each community's survival hung precariously in the balance. In response, the Tasmanians turned to their seafaring skills as the one aspect of their lives within their control. Focusing on developing innovative watercraft and navigation techniques, they set out to navigate the treacherous waters now separating their communities. Their bid for survival was desperate but determined. Drawing upon generations of expertise passed down through oral traditions, they crafted vessels capable of withstanding the fury of the waves. The development of these watercraft became a matter of life and death, as each community's ability to stay connected, share resources, and maintain cultural continuity depended on their success. Despite their best efforts, however, the Tasmanians were unable to fully mitigate the devastating impact of the land bridge's collapse. Sea levels continued to rise, and entire communities were lost forever, taking with them stories, traditions, and ways of life. As the years passed, the very identity of the Tasmanian people began to fragment, as isolated groups struggled to survive in a world irreparably changed. The Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe would go down in history as one of the most profound environmental disasters of all time, leaving an indelible mark on the ancient cultures that once thrived upon its shores. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge crumbled into the abyss, the consequences of this cataclysmic event unfolded with devastating precision. The very fabric of life on the island was rent asunder by the relentless forces of erosion and the fury of the sea. The once stable landmass had already begun to fracture, fragmenting into smaller islands that created treacherous channels and straits. Any settlement that dared linger in its path was imperiled by the capricious tides of fate. Yet it was not just the physical landscape that was ravaged. The very foundations of the Tasmanian people's way of life were also laid low. As the land bridge continued to disintegrate, massive tsunamis began to batter the coastlines with unrelenting ferocity. These monstrous waves crashed down upon the shore with the force of 1,000 thunderstorms, sending entire settlements tumbling into the churning sea. The cries of the desperate and the dying mingled with the screams of the terrified as the very earth seemed to shudder beneath their feet. The first wave struck without warning, its towering crest looming above the horizon like a dark and foreboding behemoth. It crashed down upon the shore with devastating force, sweeping away entire villages and the people who called them home. The sound of its fury still echoes through the annals of history, a cacophony of chaos and destruction that would be etched into the collective memory of the Tasmanian people for eternity. As the survivors struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster, the second wave crashed down with equal ferocity. And then the third and the fourth. Each successive wave was like a hammer blow from the gods, shattering the very foundations of existence and sending shockwaves through the land that would be felt for generations to come. The displacement of entire settlements was catastrophic. People were torn from their homes, forced to flee in panic as the waves receded, leaving behind only rubble and despair. The once thriving communities were decimated, their social structures reduced to ruin as the survivors struggled to find shelter, food, and safety in a world that had been turned upside down. The trauma of those days would never be forgotten. The memories of the Tasmanian people's darkest hour would be passed down through generations, a cautionary tale of the devastating power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit. For in the face of such unrelenting fury, it was not just the land that was lost, but also the very essence of civilization itself. In the aftermath of this cataclysmic event, the Tasmanian people were left to pick up the pieces and rebuild their shattered world. The scars of that day would remain for eternity, a poignant reminder of the devastating power of nature and the indomitable will of humanity. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe unfolded, the very fabric of the local ecosystems began to fray. The once pristine coastlines, where marine life thrived in harmony with the terrestrial world, were now beset by catastrophic consequences that would send shockwaves throughout the delicate balance of the food chain. The initial stages of the catastrophe had already taken their toll on the marine ecosystem. As the land bridge disintegrated, massive tsunamis crashed against the shore, scouring the coastline and destroying entire habitats. The resulting debris fields, littered with uprooted trees, boulders, and other detritus, would create a barren expanse that would struggle to recover for centuries. The marine life once thriving in this unique environment was now faced with an existential threat. The tsunamis had disrupted the intricate web of predator-prey relationships, sending many species into a desperate tailspin. Fish populations, which relied on specific habitats and food sources, began to dwindle as their homes were destroyed or altered beyond recognition. The iconic Tasmanian sea lions, with their thick coats and powerful flippers, had long relied on the rich marine life surrounding the land bridge. With their habitats disrupted and prey populations decimated, sea lion numbers began to plummet. Their rookeries, once teeming with activity, were now silent and still. The terrestrial world was not immune to the catastrophe's impact. The food chain was drastically altered, and inland species like wallabies and possums that relied on the sea lions for a source of food or shelter began to struggle as their primary prey disappeared. The once thriving grasslands, which had benefited from the rich nutrients washed in by the ocean's tides, were now beset by drought and famine. The Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe was not just an environmental disaster, it was a social and cultural catastrophe that would reshape the very fabric of indigenous society. The displacement of entire settlements, the loss of traditional food sources, and the disruption of sacred sites would have far-reaching consequences for the original inhabitants of Tasmania. But as the ecosystems continued to unravel, the people were forced to adapt, to a new reality, one where their very survival was threatened by the devastating impact of this cataclysmic event. In the aftermath, the Tasmanian environment would never be the same. The once pristine coastlines would take centuries to recover, and the delicate balance of the food chain would be forever altered. As we gaze upon the desolate landscape, we are reminded of the profound impact that this catastrophic event had on the very foundations of life in Tasmania. The Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe of circa 5200 BCE. The aftermath of calamity. As the fragile land bridge disintegrated, a dark tapestry of chaos and despair began to unfold. Massive tsunamis ravaged the coastlines, their thunderous roar echoing through valleys as they crashed against the shore with merciless fury. The consequences were nothing short of catastrophic. Generations-old settlements were reduced to rubble, leaving their inhabitants scattered or lost in the maelstrom. The very foundation of community and culture was shaken, leaving only a faint glimmer of hope amidst the devastation. But the destruction did not stop at the shores. Tsunamis' far-reaching tentacles extended into the depths of the ocean, sending shockwaves through the marine ecosystem. The delicate balance of the sea's food chain were shattered as species began to vanish or adapt in desperate attempts to survive. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, the Tasmanian wilderness seemed to writhe in agony. Once lush forests stood as skeletal sentinels, their branches grasping towards a gray and unforgiving sky, like nature's own dark monument to despair. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and death as putrid remains of sea creatures washed upon the shores, a grim reminder of the devastation. In this desolate landscape, remnants of human civilization clung to existence, their survival hanging precariously in balance. Communities that once thrived were reduced to scattered groups of survivors, eking out meager existences amidst ruins. The psychological toll of trauma would be felt for generations to come as people struggled to rebuild and reconcile with the unforgiving reality. In the face of such destruction, Tasmanian people turned to their ancient traditions and spiritual practices in search of solace. The land itself seemed to have lost its power to nurture life, leaving only whispers of a once vibrant culture to guide them through dark days ahead. As the dust settled on this apocalyptic landscape, the Tasmanian people began the long journey towards recovery, their hearts heavy with grief and spirits tempered by fate's unforgiving hand. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe unfolded, the very foundations of the island's ecosystem began to crumble. Sudden loss of landmass sent shockwaves through the ocean, disrupting the delicate balance of the food chain and plunging marine life into crisis. In this desperate hour, a few determined groups refused to accept their fate. They knew that migrating to higher ground or finding refuge in newly formed islands could be a matter of life and death. Driven by a fierce determination to survive, these resilient individuals set out on an arduous journey. As they departed the ravaged coastlines, they left behind a trail of destruction. The once pristine beaches were now littered with debris from the crumbling landmass, while the skies hung heavy with the acrid smell of smoke and ash. The air was thick with the cries of panicked wildlife struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. The migrants' first challenge was navigating the treacherous terrain of the newly formed islands. These tiny outcroppings of rock and soil were pockmarked with jagged cliffs, treacherous ravines, and shifting sands. The travelers had to contend with the unforgiving elements, the relentless wind, the biting cold, and the scorching sun beating down on their weary faces. As they traversed these unforgiving landscapes, the survivors encountered a myriad of dangers. Giant saltwater crocodiles, once content in their coastal habitats, now roamed the newly formed islands, seeking refuge from the ravaged mainland. Fierce sea eagles and predatory seals, sensing the vulnerability of their human prey, stalked them relentlessly. Despite these perils, the Tasmanian groups persevered, driven by an unyielding desire to preserve their way of life. They adapted to their new environments with remarkable resilience, exploiting the limited resources available on the islands. The resourceful survivors fashioned crude tools from flint and obsidian, using them to hunt the meager game that had managed to thrive in this harsh new world. As they settled into their new homes, these intrepid individuals began to rebuild their communities. They constructed makeshift shelters from driftwood and woven reeds, crafting primitive tools for hunting and gathering. The rhythms of life slowly returned as they worked tirelessly to create a new reality. In the midst of this chaos Ancient traditions were preserved, passed down through generations of survivors. Stories of the catastrophe's aftermath were etched into the fabric of Tasmanian culture, serving as a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who had faced unimaginable challenges. And so, on these newly formed islands, a new chapter in Tasmania's history began, a chapter marked by hardship, perseverance, and an unyielding determination to survive against all odds. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge succumbed to catastrophic collapse, massive waves ravaged coastlines, leaving once thriving communities reeling from the devastation's far-reaching consequences. The environmental disaster would forever alter the fabric of their societies and cultures. As the dust settled, survivors emerged from the wreckage, their lives transformed by the cataclysmic event that had rent asunder the earth beneath their feet. Familiar landscapes became scarred and ravaged, yielding a desolate landscape of twisted rock formations and darkened valleys. Initially, shock and chaos gave way to numbness, as if survivors walked through a surreal nightmare from which they couldn't awaken. The constant din of screams, wails, and cries for help still echoed in their minds, mingling with the acrid scent of smoke and ash that hung heavy in the air. In the aftermath, entire villages were reduced to rubble, leaving families torn apart and communities decimated. Traditional social structures, intricate networks of kinship, trade, and cultural exchange, lay shattered like broken pottery on the floor. Survivors stumbled through this new reality, struggling to make sense of a world that was no longer their own. As news of the disaster spread, whispers began circulating about supernatural forces behind the cataclysm. Some believed the gods had unleashed the wrath of the land bridge's collapse, while others whispered of ancient curses and forgotten prophecies come true. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, traditional ways of life were called into question as people searched for answers in a world gone mad. In the face of overwhelming trauma, many individuals retreated to familiar rituals and practices, seeking comfort in time-honored traditions of their ancestors. Elders gathered around flickering fires, sharing stories of resilience and survival, while young ones listened with wide eyes, drinking in lessons of hard-won wisdom. Yet, even as communities struggled to rebuild and recover, the very foundations of their societies began to shift. The land bridge catastrophe had unleashed a seismic shock that would reverberate throughout generations, reshaping the cultural and social landscape of Tasmania forevermore. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe unfolded, Tasmania's once stable landscape was ravaged by the sudden and catastrophic rise in sea levels. The trauma inflicted upon the indigenous population was compounded as the very foundation of their existence. The land bridge began to disintegrate. The experience for those who had managed to cling to higher ground or find refuge on newly formed islands was one of desperation and chaos. The sounds of cracking ice and howling wind were a constant reminder of nature's unrelenting fury as the sea encroached upon their homelands. The air was thick with the acrid smell of salt water and the cries of displaced animals. As weeks turned into months, the Tasmanian people struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen them. Their ancient traditions, passed down through generations, were being eroded by the relentless tide. Sacred sites, once imbued with spiritual significance, were now threatened by the encroaching sea. The social fabric of these communities was torn asunder as families were separated and entire clans were forced to flee their ancestral lands. The trauma of this displacement was compounded by the loss of cultural artifacts, ceremonial grounds, and the very memories that had been passed down through generations. In the midst of chaos, the Tasmanian people found solace in their shared experiences of survival and resilience. As they navigated treacherous waters and makeshift settlements, they drew upon their deep-seated connection to the land and innate resourcefulness to adapt to the new reality. Despite the devastating impact on their way of life, the Tasmanian people refused to be defeated by the cataclysmic forces that had beset them. They rallied around one another, drawing strength from their collective grief and determination to persevere. In this darkest of hours, they discovered a newfound sense of solidarity, forged in the fire of adversity. As years passed, the Tasmanian people slowly began to rebuild, their resilience tempered by the trials of the past. Though forever changed by the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe, they emerged from the ashes like the phoenix, their cultural heritage and traditions reborn in the face of unimaginable adversity around 40 BCE. As the catastrophe unfolded, Tasmania's fragile landscape clung tenuously to existence. The relentless pounding of waves had already exacted its toll, but the worst was yet to come. An aura of unease hung heavy in the air, as if reality itself teetered on the brink of collapse. The calm before the storm was palpable, a stillness that seemed almost surreal. Tasmanians gazed out upon their world with trepidation and resignation, aware that their environment's delicate balance had been severely disrupted. The skies darkened like a mad artist's canvas, as if the heavens themselves conspired against them. Without warning, the storm surge struck borne from the depths of the Tasmanian Sea. It swept across the region with fury that defied comprehension, waves rising like giants as they crashed down upon the already battered coastline. The roar was deafening, a cacophony of sound that shook the earth's foundations. As the surge inundated the remaining landmasses, Tasmanians were caught off guard, unable to fathom the sheer force of nature unleashed before them. The air reeked of salt and seaweed, as if the sea reclaimed its lost territory. Panic set in as families scrambled to escape the rising waters, their homes and livelihoods washed away like flotsam. The once blue skies turned a sickly shade of gray, as if the sun itself was consumed by the torrential downpour. The storm raged on, its power unrelenting, until finally it receded, leaving devastation in its wake. As the waters withdrew, survivors surveyed the destruction around them. The landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Isolated islands now stood where once thriving land masses had been. Tasmania was no longer connected to the Australian continent. Its isolation became a bitter reality. The people of Tasmania gazed upon their new world with desolation and despair. Their way of life had been shattered, their very existence threatened by the catastrophe that had unfolded before them. The trauma and disruption caused by this environmental disaster would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the course of their history for generations to come. In the aftermath, Tasmanians struggled to rebuild and adapt in a world forever changed, a world where their connection to the mainland was but a distant memory lost beneath the waves of time. The Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe unfolded like a catastrophic reckoning, shaking the very foundations of the land. The earth convulsed beneath the feet of its inhabitants, as if the planet itself was being torn asunder. Tremors rippled through the landscape, precipitating a chain reaction of seismic events that reshaped the terrain. As the skies darkened and the winds howled in torment, the atmosphere charged with an electric energy that seemed to reverberate through every molecule. The air vibrated with an otherworldly power, as if nature itself was protesting the cataclysmic unfolding before it. Suddenly, a behemoth of a storm descended upon the region, its fury unmatched by any previous tempest. The storm surge, driven by forces beyond human comprehension, swept across the landscape like a mighty tide, inundating what remained of the land masses and severing Tasmania's connection to the mainland. The cries of those caught in the maelstrom echoed through the desolate wasteland, as if the very earth itself was writhing in agony. As the storm raged on, the survivors huddled together in terror, their screams drowned out by the cacophony of crashing waves and shattering land masses. The once pristine shores were now awash with a churning sea, as if the waters themselves had conspired against the island's inhabitants. And when the tempest finally passed, the devastation was absolute. The landscape lay ravaged, its contours reshaped by the fury of the storms. Tasmania, once connected to the mainland by a fragile thread of land, now stood alone, an island, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. As the Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe drew to its devastating close, the ancient fabric of Oceania was forever rent asunder. The once thriving land masses that had connected Tasmania to the Australian mainland for millennia vanished beneath the waves, leaving only memories. The storm surge that ravaged the region moments before had left a trail of destruction and despair in its wake. Survivors of this cataclysmic event were forced to confront the harsh reality of their new world. Tasmania, once a gateway to Oceania's rich cultural tapestry, was now an isolated island, severed from the mainland and its people. The aftermath was marked by chaos and uncertainty as remnants of communities that had thrived on the land bridge struggled to come to terms with their new reality. Once fertile lands that had provided for generations gave way to a desolate landscape of sea and rock forever lost. As survivors worked to rebuild and adapt, they were forced to confront the profound impact this environmental disaster had on their way of life. The Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe marked a turning point in ancient Oceania's cultural development, forever altering the trajectory of human history in the region. In the face of such catastrophic change, early humans' resilience and adaptability were put to the test. Yet, despite overwhelming challenges, they persevered, driven by determination to survive and thrive in their new world. The Tasmanian Land Bridge catastrophe serves as a poignant reminder of the profound impact the natural events can have on shaping human societies. It is a testament to nature's enduring power, which has shaped human history for millennia and will continue to do so for generations to come.